This happened recently at a warehouse in Arizona that I've worked at overnight for the last few years. I was halfway through my shift when I heard sirens. At first I didn't think much of it. This area wasn't exactly known for being quiet, and it wasn't uncommon for police to roll through at odd hours. But this was different, and I knew something bigger was happening. I walked toward the loading dock, peering out through the small window in the steel door. ICE agents were swarming the factory across the street, and I assumed they must have been rounding up some undocumented workers. Some people were already in handcuffs, others being questioned. I just watched for a while. My family had come to this country from Mexico legally 3 generations ago. We did things the right way, and both my dad and uncle proudly served in the US military. We all love this country, and to be honest, I personally feel that immigration has gotten out of hand. Still, I remember it was kind of a creepy thing to see. People getting loaded into the back of transport vans and processed and all of that. I opened the door and stepped outside to get a better view. From across the street, one of the ICE officers noticed me and began walking over. When she got close, she asked me my name and for my ID, which I provided. She told me that they were doing a raid and asked me if I knew or had seen a certain person and showed me a photograph. I didn't recognize him. She then cautioned me to be careful because the entire raid had centered around capturing this guy, and evidently he was suspected in the murder of a local couple. I told her I understood and would call the police immediately if I saw him. She walked back across the street where I saw her talk to a few other officers, gesturing toward me and the warehouse. I then walked back inside and was heading to the office to take my break. That's when I heard something inside the warehouse. A rustling noise, or a shuffling of movement or something. I spun around and looked but didn't see anybody. Most of the night crew had already clocked out. There were maybe 1 or 2 guys left somewhere in the building, but I didn't hear the hum of the forklifts or the beeping of inventory scanners. It was possible everybody else was gone by now, except for me. I turned, slowly scanning the long aisles between shelves stacked high with pallets. That's when I saw it. The side door, usually locked, was cracked open just slightly. Someone had come in. I felt my pulse pick up when I put 2 and 2 together. It had to have been one of the guys running from ICE, and possibly the guy they were looking for. I just stood there, listening, and could feel my stomach start getting this sick feeling. All these crazy thoughts started going through my head. If there was somebody in here with me, and they were desperate enough to run away from ICE, what else were they willing to do to keep themselves from getting caught, especially if it was someone who had possibly murdered before? Right then, a sound came from one of the aisles to my left. It was like something had fallen off one of the shelves, like a piece of aluminum trim or something clattering to the concrete. I walked past the end of the aisle and looked down the length of it. At the same moment that I rounded the corner, I saw a figure disappearing behind a stack of pallets. It was a man. His face and neck were covered in tattoos. There was a long silence. I didn't know what to do. I called out to him and told him that he needed to leave right now, or I was going to go get the ICE officers outside. There was no response. Cautiously, I started backing away, heading toward the loading dock door. As I did, I could hear him start moving toward me, that sound that sneakers make when you're running on concrete. He went from being completely still behind those pallets to full-on sprinting directly toward me. I am a big guy, and I'm not afraid to say I'm pretty overweight, so I started running as best I could, but I am by no means fast. I began weaving through the aisles of the warehouse, making my way toward the exit, but I could hear the guy following after me, and he was fast. I swerved around a stack of pallets, knocking over a loose crate in the process. It crashed to the ground, spilling boxes or something all over the floor. I didn't stop to look and just kept sprinting toward the loading dock. But as I entered it, I felt the guy grab me by the back of the collar and yank me down on my back with all of his strength. I hit the ground hard and the wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to get up and away, but this dude was already trying to choke me. It was the single scariest thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life. I literally believed I was going to die right there and then. At that moment, by some miracle, that same lady ICE officer and 2 other agents came through the side door, presumably to ask me more questions. They turned when they saw the noise and raised their weapons on this guy. Everyone started screaming. It was total mayhem, and the guy on top of me was immediately off and running for an exit. They pushed past me, weapons drawn, storming after him into the warehouse. They were able to catch the guy because there were no other exits for him to escape out of. They called an ambulance to come check me out. I was fine, just never been that scared in my life. It took a long time for my heart rate to come down. I still work at that warehouse, but I'm always extra cautious about the doors being locked now, and my boss has been okay with me carrying a sidearm for the extra protection. But I will never forget the night that I almost died on the floor at work. I worked for ICE from 2017 to 2022. Without getting into all the politics surrounding it, I want to tell you the craziest thing that ever happened to me while I was working as an agent. I've told this story many times since it happened, and I will likely tell it many more. It was delegated to myself and another agent as a low-impact routine raid. A safe house in a rundown neighborhood, likely a stash spot for undocumented immigrants being shuffled through cartel pipelines. A lot of these guys are just very poor people looking for a better life, so it isn't always the greatest feeling detaining them, but it was our job. We were sent to confirm, secure, and detain, standard procedure. My partner and I both thought something felt off as soon as we pulled up to the area. When ICE shows up, usually people scatter. There's yelling, running, doors slamming, all the stuff you imagine there would be. This time though, there was nothing. Just a one-story house with boarded-up windows and an open door swaying on the hinges. It was so run down we joked about whether this was even the right place. We got out and moved in cautiously. We knocked on the doorframe, but nobody responded. The house stank like a dumpster. It was disgusting. Inside, dirty mattresses were thrown on the floor. Plates of half-eaten food sat abandoned on crates. Someone had been there. Probably not that long ago, but now it was empty, or so we thought. Then we found him. This older guy, crouched in the back corner of a bedroom, hands raised. He looked completely malnourished and his clothes were stained with sweat. He was muttering to himself in Spanish. He didn't want trouble, he just wanted out. My partner moved toward him, radio in hand, ready to call it in. That's when I heard it. The faintest shift in the walls. A creak of floorboards behind us. Something wasn't right. That's when my partner's radio squawked that additional units were on their way to us and that we needed to abort the raid. Before we had time to process this, multiple figures erupted from the shadows. Closets, a hidden panel in the wall, and the back of the house. Fast, practiced movements. The first shot cracked through the air, and my partner stumbled backward, yelling out in pain before he hit the floor. I had no time to react before someone was on me, grabbing for my gun. I elbowed the guy in the face, fought to regain control, but then there were multiple guys punching me in the face and throwing me on the ground. If I'm being honest, I was getting my ass handed to me. 2 or 3 guys stomping on me, one swinging a bat or something hitting me in the legs and ribs. I could hear my partner groaning and rolling around on the floor in agony. One of them gripped my wrist, trying to wrestle away my gun. Another hooked his forearm around my throat. They were all shouting, and I remember one of them saying something in broken English about making an example out of us. My vision got darker, and it was honestly getting to the point where I was either going to pass out from being concussed or asphyxiate. And then, sirens. Loud and blaring, cutting through the chaos. The only conclusion I could ever come to was that whoever tipped us off about the place must have had a change of heart and tipped them off too. The attackers panicked. The grip on my wrist and hand let go just enough for me to fire off a couple shots into the ceiling. Footsteps pounded away from us. They were darting through windows and out the back door. The sirens were right on top of us, blue flashing lights through the torn-up curtains. My partner was on his side, blood pooling beneath him. I was able to get up, grab him by the vest, and start dragging him toward the front door, calling out to our guys outside. More agents swarmed in, securing the house, clearing rooms, and yelling orders. By the time I got us outside, an ambulance was already pulling up. I sat on the curb and puked. My hands were covered in blood. In the end, my partner made a full recovery, and I walked away with one broken rib and a busted up face and leg, but I'm fine now. We caught 2 of what we believe to be 6 guys. We also gained information that the cartel had set us up, lured us in with bad intel, and no joke planned to kill us. If backup had arrived even a minute later, we wouldn't have made it out. I work in a completely different field now, but I'm convinced that as long as I live, that will be the most messed up and memorable thing that ever happens to me. It happened one evening while I was finishing up some chores around the house. I had just finished washing the dishes when I heard the knock at my front door. Not a gentle tap, but firm, authoritative. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a man in a dark jacket wearing a badge clipped to his belt. It was Ice. My stomach tightened. My mother had come from El Salvador when she was a child. My father was from Texas. They met, married, and built a life together. Regardless, the sight of immigration officers at your door does something to you, especially as a mixed Hispanic woman. I opened the door but left the chain on. He told me they had reason to believe that an undocumented individual was residing at my address and that I needed to step aside and answer a few questions. I told him there was no one here but me and that he had the wrong house. But he repeated himself and told me to step outside, now. Something was off. I had seen ICE raids on the news, but this wasn't how they worked. They didn't send a single officer to someone's house alone. I told him I wanted to see some ID. His expression changed, and that's when the shift happened. He stopped trying to sound official and leaned in closer. He told me that if I didn't cooperate, he'd have to take me in. I told him I needed to call my lawyer and reached for my phone. That's when he slammed his shoulder into the door. The chain barely held for half a second before it snapped off, sending me stumbling backward. My heart shot up into my throat and he stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. I spun around and ran down the hall, my body moving before my brain could fully process what was happening. He was right behind me. I could hear him pounding across the floor. I locked myself in the bathroom. My hands were shaking so bad I was barely able to open the window. I climbed out and landed hard on the grass. I sprained my ankle in the fall, though I wouldn't fully realize it until much later. I scrambled up, sprinting toward my neighbor's house. I heard the front door burst open again as he followed me outside. I pounded on my neighbor's door and shouted for help, telling him to call the police. The porch light flicked on, and my neighbor, an older man named Jim, opened the door. That's when the man chasing me stopped. He stood there, just at the edge of Jim's porch light, out of breath. For a moment, I thought he might make a move for me anyway, but Jim immediately understood the situation and yelled at the man, telling him that he was armed and that his wife was calling the police. The guy immediately turned and ran, disappearing off into the dark. The police arrived probably 15 minutes later. I was still shaking when I told them what happened. One officer took my statement while another one checked my house. Later, they confirmed what I already suspected. He wasn't an ICE agent. He wasn't law enforcement at all. He was a predator, posing as an ICE agent to get women alone and access to their homes. They found a car they suspected to be his abandoned vehicle a few blocks away. Inside, they discovered zip ties, duct tape, and a knife. When they ran the plates, they found out it was stolen. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying it over and over in my mind. If I had hesitated even for a second longer before running, or if my neighbor hadn't been home or didn't answer the door, I don't know how things would have ended up for me. The guy was never caught, but the police believe he had done this before based on other reports in the area. Until I could fully relocate, I stayed with my parents, unable to shake the feeling that one night I'd open my door and see him standing there again. Even now, years later, I always double-check the locks and never answer the door unless I know who's on the other side. And I'll always remember how close I came to never being seen again.